In the United States, what a defense lawyer does in a death penalty case, her skills, her training, and what she does to prepare and present her case, this more than anything else determines who receives a death sentence. So the ABA guidelines were urgently needed to help defense lawyers, like all of us, understand their obligations and duties. There are at least 3 major reasons that defense representation guidelines are important in any death penalty system. First, guidelines help us become better lawyers. The guidelines are a kind of map for lawyers, instructions about how we can become the best lawyers we can be. The guidelines tell us what good lawyers must do to be successful in their cases. They tell us how to avoid making common mistakes. And they establish a professional standard that all lawyers must meet. And when we raise the quality of legal representation, we see more justice in our cases, and we can save more of our clients. Secondly, guidelines teach judges and government officials about what defense lawyers do in death penalty cases. In the US and in many countries where I've taught, I've often found that judges don't understand the job of a defense lawyer. Guidelines help judges understand why we need more funding, for example, or experts, or more time and resources to do our jobs. And they can also help appellate judges understand the mistakes that defense lawyers made at trial so that wrongful convictions can be corrected on appeal. This is critical because in every country, government officials and judges make decisions that affect how defense lawyers do their jobs. And third, guidelines can help influence good changes to the law. Guidelines can help courts, legislators, and government officials understand why and how their laws and procedures should change. For example, in the United States, there are many places where defense lawyers are required to comply with the ABA guidelines. And in these places, lawyers can expect to receive better funding, more time, and more resources to help them do their jobs. These are changes that occurred only after government officials and judges understood the importance of supporting high-quality defense representation. And the ABA guidelines helped bring about that understanding and those changes in the law. But how did we get here? I'd like to tell you next about the process for creating the guidelines. In 2003, I was the director of the American Bar Association Death Penalty Representation Project, and I led this effort. My first step was to form a committee of the most experienced defense lawyers in the country, as well as law professors, judges, and others to work on this project. We needed the smartest and most dedicated people for our task. Our committee began by reviewing many death penalty cases and identifying what strategies and practices had worked best. It was also important for us to understand what practices had failed, what mistakes we had made over and over again, and why. We looked at court decisions. We looked at laws, procedures, and other standards that had been developed in the past. And we identified a goal to guide our effort. And that goal was to create a resource that would describe the kind of zealous defense effort that everyone facing a death sentence should receive. So this was a collective effort to gather the very best ideas and practices and compile them into a single set of guidelines that everyone could understand and access. The guidelines have two parts. The first part describes how judges and governments must support the work of defense lawyers. They describe what defense lawyers need to do their jobs, what kind of time and funding and resources are necessary. They make clear that when a government decides to seek the death penalty, that same government has an obligation to ensure an adequate defense. And the second set of the guidelines was for defense lawyers. Here we talked about lawyers' specific obligations in their cases. For example, the duty to receive specialized training, to thoroughly investigate their cases, to seek the assistance of mental health experts, and to be zealous and diligent. We annotated our guidelines with citations to cases, to academic studies, to other standards, and to ethical responsibilities. And this was to show that each guideline had a history, had an explanation, and a solid grounding in the law. In other words, none of the guidelines were new ideas. We did not create new obligations. Our committee carefully identified and created a resource that described the existing standard of care and into a resource we called the ABA guidelines. I am sure that each of you in your own legal communities could do the very same. This project took well over a year to complete. But by 2003, we had compiled a set of guidelines that became a comprehensive manual for the defense of death penalty cases. Once the guidelines were collected, we asked the American Bar Association to accept them as official policy. And I met with many different groups within the ABA to seek their support, including groups of judges, groups of prosecutors, civil lawyers, and many others to explain why we thought the guidelines were necessary and important. And ultimately, the guidelines were overwhelmingly passed as official policy of the ABA. Now, this was not a statement about the death penalty itself. The ABA does not advocate for the use of the death penalty or its abolition. This was a statement about a principle that both death penalty supporters and abolitionists could support. That if the death penalty was used, we must guarantee fairness and accuracy by providing everyone with a skilled and qualified defense lawyer. There was special significance to the ABA's decision. The ABA is the biggest organization of lawyers in the world. So the ABA name and its approval gave the guidelines credibility and status, a critical step to establishing them as a national standard. Other death penalty countries have been inspired to follow the lead of the ABA. In Japan, I worked with the All Japan Bar Association, and they created their own guidelines for their death penalty defense lawyers. I also worked with the Bar Association and others in China on representation guidelines that were used in 2 Chinese provinces. Bar associations can be especially helpful with an effort like this because they can lend credibility and authority. But the most important objective is for defense lawyers, people who understand and know this work, to develop guidelines for their community that are practical, useful, and advance the goal of ensuring high quality defense representation in death penalty cases.